Hello, this is Max Grunig from Ecological Institute hosting a POCACITO webinar today. I'm sorry for the delay in the start time. I was actually delayed a little bit this morning and wasn't able to start it from on the road. I will directly now hand over to my colleague Alan Silayan, who will present today from Clean Air Asia, and he will also be able to answer your questions. So this is a POCACITO Post-Carbon Cities of Tomorrow webinar. We're here to talk about climate change and clean air and how they are related. And I hope this will be insightful for all of you. Definitely for I think this is something a little bit more technical for some of us. I think it's also very interesting because it's a perspective informed from Southeast Asia, and we will be able to hear something beyond the usual scope of Europe and North America, where we usually look at. And I think that's kind of exciting for us. Alan, we can already see your screen. We can't see you, but big deal. Yes, hello. Alan, good morning or good evening, rather. It's past 10 p.m. your time. It's kind of late. Thank you so much for being willing and able to do this at such a late time. And also really glad that the technology is working now. We're on the air, so you can start right away. If you want to share your camera, if you do have a camera, that's totally great. Otherwise, we'll just deal with the main screen, and we'll be able to focus even more on the main screen. And again, as usual, we will have a presentation, and later on we'll be able to then also answer questions. Now we can see you. Hello, Alan. Good evening, and thank you for joining us from Manila, from the Philippines. And I will be quiet now. I'll be back on later on after your presentation and then for questions. Dear participants, thank you for bearing with us the extra 5 minutes. I hope that was not too boring. I wish we could add the time at the end, but this simply means that our session is 5 minutes shorter today. You can still ask questions as usual. There's several ways how to do this. You can raise your hand, you can type in the question pane, or you can start a chat. I'll monitor these. Alan, you don't have to worry about these features. I'll just let you know when people have questions. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Max. It's an honor to be here. And good morning to everyone who's at the webinar, and thank you for joining us. We'll be talking about short-lived climate pollutants and how that impacts the environment. And I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Alan Silayan. I'm part of Clean Air Asia, and my organization. We started in 2001 as part of an ADB, World Bank and USAID project. But since then, we've moved forward, and we're now an independent NGO working on air quality here in Asia. And we work on air quality and climate change, sustainable urban transport, and also cities for clean air. And we have an office in China and India, and we partner with our colleagues in Indonesia, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, and also here in the Philippines. Of course, the Philippines here is our main office. So let me just go right into it. Short-lived climate pollutants. What are they? So SLCPs, or short-lived climate pollutants, are substances with, they are relatively short lifetime in the atmosphere, and they do have a warming influence in the near-term climate. So unlike, for instance, carbon dioxide, where you would have that stays in the atmosphere for up to 100+ years, short-lived climate pollutants are relatively well, they are in the atmosphere not for very long. For instance, if you can see the screen, black carbon is just in the atmosphere for a few days. Methane is there for 12 years, still quite long, but relative to carbon dioxide is quite short. Tropospheric ozone, that's just there for weeks, and hydrofluorocarbons, which is there for 15 years, more or less. So they do have an influence on our climate, and at the same time, they are a pollutant. So unlike carbon dioxide, they are not considered, carbon dioxide is not considered a pollutant, but these gases are, because they affect the health of human beings. So I'm just gonna go right into it. Black carbon is and the co-pollutants associated with black carbon come from the incomplete combustion of fossil fuels. And typically, when I talk about black carbon, well, you see that in particular with diesel engines that are not very well maintained, for example. But in Asia, we have a host of different sources. For example, there are areas in Asia where the household cooking and heating is still done by traditional means, through traditional cook stoves or heating stoves, and using wood, or in some areas coal. There is also, for example, in South Asia, there is an issue on the manufacturing of bricks using traditional methods. And so these are industrial coal and brick kilns. Open burning is an issue. That's an issue in some areas, for example, in the outskirts of Hanoi, or sometimes in the outskirts of Chennai. You have agricultural areas that after the harvest season, there is burning of the residual waste of agriculture, and that causes actually both white and black carbon, organic carbon and black carbon burning. So there's also on-road diesel engines and off-road diesel engines. So when I say off-road diesel engines, that could be for construction, or, for example, mining machines. So these would be the sources. And the impacts, well, you have suspension of black carbon in the atmosphere, and they contribute to global warming by absorbing energy and converting this energy into heat. Now, there is also what happens when black carbon settles after a few days, and it sometimes settles on glaciers. For example, in particular, for example, say Chile. There's mining going on in the Atacama Desert. There's a lot of black carbon happening and emitted. But when the black carbon, it settles down on the mountain areas, it does settle on the glaciers, and it has this albedo effect, which absorbs more heat because it is black on on that white surface, and it increases the melting rate of the glaciers. And so for countries like Chile, or say Nepal, where a huge amount of their fresh water comes from glaciers, this is a serious concern. So recent studies show that black carbon is 15% of global particulate matter, 2.5 microns, and transportation emissions is approximately 50% of black carbon. So now we're also finding new sources. So the traditional sources, as what I've mentioned already, are old diesel engines, household cooking, also household, and also yeah. And so, but there are new areas such as kerosene lamps that we're now considering, gas flaring, diesel generators, trash burning, as I already mentioned, household heating and cooking, as mentioned previously. And here what we're saying is top countries for gas flaring have been Russia and Nigeria. So there's a lot of gas being flared, and oftentimes as it's being flared, there's incomplete combustion and you have black carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. So as mentioned already, there's a warming effect. There is increased rate of melting glaciers through the albedo effect. And oftentimes black carbon is always emitted with other pollutants such as NOx, NH4, non-methane volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, or brown carbon. Some studies have further linked anthropogenic aerosols, including black carbon, with changes in regional climate and hydrological cycles. For example, increasing frequency of droughts and floods. And for example, here in the Philippines, where we have a monsoon season, it does have an impact on our weather patterns. And these are short-term weather patterns. Another short-lived climate pollutant, as mentioned earlier, is methane or methane, depending on where you are in the world. So methane emissions mostly come from agricultural sources. So it comes from, for example, enteric fermentation of livestock, cultivation of rice, waste management, wastewater treatment, and others. So it's basically any organic material that decomposes in a situation without air. So in that decomposition process, you have methane. And 29% of this is really coming from fossil fuels. As fossil fuels are mined, there are methane gas chambers which need to be flared for safety purposes. Now, the impacts of methane, globally, methane emissions are responsible for half of the observed rise in ozone levels. So I'll talk about ozone in a bit, but methane is a precursor gas to ozone. And while methane does not cause direct harm to human health or crop production, it is a precursor to ozone, as mentioned. And ozone does have an impact on human health and crop production. And I will get to that later. But for now, let's just talk a bit more about methane. And as I mentioned, the sources are primarily agricultural activities and the fossil fuel industry. Methane concentrations have been observed to be increasing in the atmosphere since 2000, well, throughout, but there's been a surge since 2004, 2014 to 2015. And the Russian oil industry is a significant contributor to global methane emissions. Now, continued increase in methane emissions could thwart our efforts currently in reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So what we're saying is while carbon dioxide emissions must be mitigated, they should be done simultaneously with methane mitigation actions as well, in order to increase the chance of meeting our climate targets. I'll talk about that a bit more in a few more slides, but yeah, let's just leave that for now. So what we're finding is that methane, the impact of methane on climate change is actually much bigger than previously observed. And the impact has largely been undervalued because previous studies have excluded its shortwave absorption characteristics. So in 2013, in an assessment by the IPCC, the global potential of methane was at 38 previously, but because of the study, they're saying now that the global warming potential of methane should be at 32, which is approximately a 25% increase. So another thing is, unlike carbon dioxide, methane is not absorbed in the carbon cycle. And this also contributes to the stronger warming potential of methane. So, but despite the short lifetime of methane in the atmosphere, what they're saying is also methane is responsible for the methane-induced thermal expansion of the ocean. So that's also, that methane also has an impact on that. And we're also looking at methane trapped in permafrost. So as global warming continues, we have areas that have been permanently frozen for eons, which are now defrosting. And in those frozen areas are methane clathrates, or methane, trapped methane essentially, which are already slowly being emitted into the atmosphere, which compounds the global warming effect. Basically, this is just a slide indicating methane impacts on crop yields. So carbon dioxide somehow, well, there is a decrease of crop yields with heat. If you apply heat, and there is a decreasing yield in crops. There's drought. There's also decrease in crop yields. But unlike carbon dioxide, so carbon dioxide, because there is an increase of concentration, what they're saying is there's probably most likely an increase in crop yields because of the increased concentration of carbon dioxide. But because methane does not have any fertilization effect, so it has no impact on crop yields in terms of fertilization. But for methane is also a precursor to ozone, and ozone has a negative impact on crop yields. So that has another aspect to methane. So speaking about ozone, and we're talking about tropospheric ozone here. We're not talking about the stratospheric ozone that is essential, or the so-called ozone layer that's needed to protect the Earth. This is the stratospheric ozone we're talking about, that is in the layer of the air we breathe. So, and this ozone present in this area in the stratosphere is not healthy for human beings. Now, ozone in the stratosphere is created through a mixture of methane, carbon monoxide, non-methane organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, and the addition of sunlight. You have ozone. And so it's a mixture of various things, emissions from transportation, from industry, from methane, from agriculture. Mix that all up and add sunlight, you get ozone. Now, there is an impact. Ozone has a negative impact to our health, especially to the more vulnerable areas of society, like the elderly and the very young. But also, studies have shown that it does have an impact as well on our crop yields, reducing photosynthesis and reducing the plant's ability to sequester carbon. So the final short-lived climate pollutant that we're talking about is hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, and these are greenhouse gases that are rapidly building up in the atmosphere, and they're used as replacement for ozone-depleting substances in air conditioning, foam blowing, fire retardants, and other aerosol cans, for example. So it's found, hydrofluorocarbons are now found in various cooling devices, as well as foam agents and aerosols. So in this graph here, you have CFCs or HCFCs being reduced as a result of the Montreal Protocol, but then what we replace them with are hydrofluorocarbons, which have increased. But we now know that hydrofluorocarbon is in fact a greenhouse gas, and also a short-lived climate pollutant that is harmful, that has an impact on global warming. And its lifetime in the atmosphere is approximately 15 years. Still relatively short as compared to carbon dioxide. So impacts, just to summarize, impacts of short-lived climate pollutants. So they harm public health, reduce food security, warm the atmosphere, increase ice and snow melting, and disrupt weather patterns. So if we reduce short-lived climate pollutants on a global scale, so large-scale SLCP mitigation by 2030, we can avoid approximately 0.6 degrees Celsius of global warming, 2.4 million avoided premature deaths annually, 52 million tons of avoided crop losses from 4 major staple crops per year. So these are the annual the benefits of reducing short-lived climate pollutants. So let me just quickly go through the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. So basically, because of all these impacts of short-lived climate pollutants, the coalition was formed in 2012, initially with 12 country partners. But since then, the organization has grown to more than 50, and currently there's around 62 different state members and 17 NGOs, IGOs, and around 55 NGOs. So the objective is to increase awareness of short-lived climate pollutants. This is the objective of the coalition. Enhance and develop new national and regional action by including actions including by identifying and overcoming barriers, increasing capacity, and mobilizing support. Promoting best practices and showcasing successful efforts, improving scientific understanding of short-lived climate pollutants impacts and mitigation strategies. So right now, this week, I know that the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Working Group, for example, is meeting in Nairobi, Kenya. So as mentioned, there are now 62 country partners, 17 international government organizations, and 55 NGO members. Within the CCAC, there are 11 different initiatives. So there's a heavy duty vehicles initiative, oil and gas initiative, waste, bricks, HFC initiative, household energy, and agriculture. So these are sectoral initiatives. And then below are 4 cross-cutting initiatives on SNAP stands for Support for National Action Planning. So this is support being given to countries to support their national action plan to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. So financing, assessment of short-lived climate pollutants on a regional basis, the Urban Health Initiative. So these are 4 cross-cutting initiatives. So the global agenda and why we need to reduce SLCPs. So there are several main factors at play. The primary one is really the Paris Agreement, but then there's also the SDGs and the Sendai framework. So let me talk a bit more about the Paris Agreement, because that's really the focal for climate change. So the Paris Agreement happened in COP21 in Paris in 2015. But what we're saying is, in order for this agreement to succeed, we need to go beyond looking at the agreement itself. So in order for that to happen, we need to look at the sister agreements. So the Kigali Amendment, HFC Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which says we need to start reducing HFCs also apart from CO2. So it's an amendment to the Montreal Protocol, because the Montreal Protocol had allowed HFCs to be used as coolants. But what the Kigali Amendment is saying is that HFCs also need to be reduced and then eventually replaced by other organic coolants. The agreement on aircraft emissions, efforts on shipping emissions as well, and subnational climate change, city-scale climate action plans. So these could be, for example, city climate clean air action plans, or for example, national level policy on shipping. So now, apart from these sister agreements to the Paris Agreement, we need a second level. We need to pull not just carbon dioxide, we also need to really pull on the SLCP lever. So we need to, what we're saying is we need to decarbonize the global economy with renewables, but we also need short-term major cuts in short-lived climate pollutants to maximize to the maximum extent possible, so black carbon, methane, tropospheric ozone, and HFCs, in order to be able to hit the Paris targets. Now, there is a third level, but for me, this third lever is, I would rather avoid this because, well, we do need to do forest degradation reversal and afforestation. That I'm very much for. We need to restore our forest habitat, soil restoration, and ecosystem management. But I'm not too fond of carbon dioxide direct capture and air capture and storage. So the technology for this is still very much at the experimental stage, and it could be very catastrophic if we move into this direction. So what we're saying is that through short-lived climate pollutants, we have a pathway to meet the Paris targets that is not only viable, but is economically beneficial, and is also beneficial health-wise and from a standpoint of food security. So I'm just showing this because yeah, this is accessible. This was written by the Scientific Advisory Panel of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And basically what they're advocating for is action on short-lived climate pollutants now. Now, as you may see, the actions needed for short-lived climate pollutants are not really huge. Many of these actions are actions that are already being done by countries. We just need to increase the scale at which it's being done. And the solutions are there. You know, household cooking and traditional household heating. You know, some countries are way beyond that. So it's important to assist the countries who have not yet gone beyond that to shift from traditional heating and cooking into more sustainable methods of heating and cooking for their homes. So this is the pathway to the target that I'm talking about. If you can see here, 2020, 2040, 2060, and to 2100. And these are temperature levels. So for the Paris Agreement, what we're saying is 2 degrees is the cap. This is the target. And we actually want to reduce our emissions to here, to way below 2 degrees, to a 1.5 degree regime. Now, if this is our reference, this is our business as usual, this blue line here. And then what we're saying is we want to advocate for aggressive reductions and early reductions of both long-lived greenhouse gases and short-lived greenhouse gases. So it is possible. So for this dark blue line, it's early action on SLCPs only. So if you notice here, there is reduction in temperature, but then if we don't do anything about carbon dioxide, it's still going to go runaway increased temperature. In this red line here, this is early action on greenhouse gases only, but not on short-lived climate pollutants. So what we're seeing is it will reduce in the long run, but it will still miss our targets. Now, what this purple line is saying is that we can reduce carbon dioxide and at the same time reduce SLCPs. But if we do SLCPs too late, it will be too much of a risk. And we do risk, we may still hit the 2 degrees, but it may be too much of a risk. So the ideal situation really is early action on both long-lived greenhouse gases and short-lived climate pollutants, which will result in this purple line at the very bottom, which will allow us to hit our targets. Now, by doing so, we also meet our goals for our Sustainable Development Goals for poverty reduction, agriculture, food security, healthy lives, sustainable and modern energy, and livable cities. If we do not, we end up in this red patch here with climate-related damages to public health, ecosystems, and infrastructure. So this red patch over here represents the risk that we're taking if we do not take early action on short-lived climate pollutants. This green patch over here represents what we would achieve if we do early action on short-lived climate pollutants. So basically, early mitigation of SLCPs helps to meet our sustainable development goals within the goal of climate action, reduces damages due to climate change over the next few decades, including those dependent upon the pace of climate, such as biodiversity losses, slows the amplifying feedback, such as snow and ice albedo effects that are sensitive to black carbon. We reduce the risk of potential nonlinear changes, such as the release of methane from permafrost or ice sheet collapse. Increases the probability of staying below 2 degrees Celsius through the mid-century. Reduces long-term cumulative climate impacts. Reduces costs of meeting temperature targets relative to late SLCP mitigation, and stimulates the progress towards long-term 2-degree targets through the achievement of near-term benefits. So in essence, there's so many benefits. So it's not just climate change benefits. It's climate change benefits, but a host of other benefits such as health, crop yields, economic benefits that would work to our favor if we are to reduce short-lived climate pollutants now. So in the end, it makes so much sense to do this because the technology is there. These are actually low-hanging fruits and actually no-brainers for many of the member countries of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And with that, I would like to end and open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you for this deep insight. And I wanted to say it was very, very informative. We've seen also what needs to be done, also the benefits of action beyond climate benefits. Now, how do you view the likelihood of achieving these changes, the likelihood of actually getting this done? I mean, just looking at methane, you said basically 50% from agriculture together. I mean, that's a lot, and it's a lot of different actors, a lot of different farmers. And so it's talking to a lot of people, going to a lot of people. Granted, in some countries like the US, farming is very industrialized, but in other countries, it's very much non-industrialized. So it's very, it's a challenge. You show how you have progress is being made in some areas. But just your assessment from your work, because you're very close to it, how likely are we in getting this done?
The thing about short-lived climate pollutants is that the feedback loop is very very quick. And what I mean by that is that if you have black carbon in the air, you know right away and you experience it right away. Unlike climate change, whereas you emit carbon dioxide and then you don't really feel anything going on until maybe 10, 20, 30 decades later. The feedback loop is pretty quick. And so what's happening in some cities is that people are actually demanding for cleaner air, for example. So you've seen that in China, you've seen protests in China, and since 5 years ago, China has actually improved their annual average PM 2.5 air pollution. So they've improved by 30%. Now, the same thing is happening right now in Mongolia, where people are on the streets protesting and saying, we want clean air. It's happening in Bangkok right now because the air pollution is really bad. And also, most recently, they're saying now in the UN is that clean air is a right of every human being. So, with all this happening, I'm very optimistic that we can pull this lever of reducing SLCPs in the various regions around the world. So South America is doing great work in terms of transportation and reducing emissions from diesel vehicles. Here in Asia, we're moving slowly, but we are moving steadily in reducing our air pollution, in improving, for example, our fuel standards from Euro 1 to Euro 4, and now leapfrogging to Euro 6 in some countries. For example, in Thailand, they're moving towards Euro 6 right now, simply because the air quality is so bad, and they're using this now as a means to push for the policies that do matter. So I am very hopeful, Max, that these changes are coming, and are coming much faster than we would expect. Another thing going for us is that in this world of SLCPs, it's not like the negotiations of carbon dioxide and climate change, where there's a lot of it's a negotiation atmosphere. So it's, if I bring down my emissions, maybe this country will bring it down as well, but I'm not willing to. Some countries may not be willing. There's none of that in the world of short-lived climate pollutants. People recognize that reducing it does make sense, and reducing short-lived climate pollutants, because it is a pollutant and because it has an impact directly to our health and our crop yield, does make so much sense, which is why governments are willing and taking the action to actually reduce it.
That's great, and it's great news. And of course, people being self utility maximizers, that's sad, but it's in that case working in favor of action, because they can see the benefits at home.
Yes.
They can get, either people are less upset, when they're protesting, so they might protest less, or they increase their, the economic output, or reduce health costs on the healthcare system, or costs in other infrastructure costs, or damage costs in other areas. So that's good news in a way. Of course, it would be nicer even if people would be more altruistic, and then we would probably see also more action on the long-lived greenhouse gases. But yes, this is a very good sign that we can see some action here. Just before I forget it, we had a question that's very much for everybody, because Max Held asked if we can get your slides after the webinar, if you're willing to share them.
Sure.
Great.
Do I just email that to you? Oh, I've already emailed it to you.
Yeah, I'll make a PDF out of them, and I'll share it with the participants.
Okay, great.
And if you're okay, we can also upload it to our website if you're fine with it.
That should be okay, yeah.
Good, perfect. So this is a more technical question. We do also have some content questions from the participants. I have some more questions as well. We only have 13 minutes left, so let's not linger. And again, participants, you're more than welcome to ask more questions. We'll try to get as many as possible. But let's go first to Richard Finelli, who's been already quite active with several questions. I'll try to unmute you, Richard. And if you're in a setting where you can ask your question yourself, you can do this now. I would suggest you ask your first question and we answer, or Alan answers, and then we see if later we find the time to get to your second question as well. Richard.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my question is basically whether anybody is really looking at routine maintenance on refrigeration units, air conditioning units, activities such as coil cleaning, filter replacement. The Carbon Trust recently published a paper for the Kigali Cooling Initiative Program that showed that the potential gigaton reduction from just cleaning and servicing of HVAC-R cooling equipment could be a half a gigaton of emissions reduction globally per year. And what we're finding is there's very, very little attention to this. There's some attention to the air conditioning space, nothing at all for refrigeration, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether anybody has detected activity, particularly in the refrigeration silo, which is of interest to us.
I think I received that question, Richard, on the email, and I've responded with what I know. And for example, GIZ is doing some work on refrigerant space, but not directly directed at cleaning the heat exchange mechanisms. It's being done, however, not from the perspective of reducing climate change, but it's being done on on a savings benefit. It does have benefits, for example, for industrial cooling systems, and so people do it because it saves them money. But to the extent of promoting it and having actually a campaign for this sort of practice, I'm not seeing that at the moment.
Okay, Alan, that's good to know, and I think from my work that I did years ago in Germany, we've seen that too, that it's also very difficult to get people to invest in this from public funding programs, even on the German side. We always had the challenge of then also measuring the longevity of the benefits. That was always a problem there. Whereas when you do energy efficiency improvements, very often you can do this, by charts. That might be wrong too, but you don't have to necessarily go on a case-by-case basis and measure the leakage and leaking year after year to ensure that it's actually not that you actually have these climate benefits over more than just the first year. So that's a very interesting challenge. And I wanted to come back to the HFCs, and since the Kigali Agreement kind of was hinted at, you mentioned it explicitly, and Richard also brought it up, at least indirectly. And so the Kigali Amendment as an extension of the Montreal Protocol, for those in the audience who are not familiar, and maybe Alan can say more about it, to reduce HFCs. And that's now my question to you, Alan. To me, as a more or less like layperson, maybe a little bit informed layperson, I had the impression, okay, we have the Kigali Amendment, and HFCs are, not stopped immediately, but we're phasing them down and out. And then I look at your graphs and your projections, and I get a shudder. Basically, I think, oh my, this is actually not really enough. So what do you think? Where are we with that? And how much does the Kigali Amendment actually deliver, and how much more would be needed?
So the Kigali Agreement, people are seeing the Kigali Agreement as a key lever also in reaching our targets for the Paris Agreement. And what they're saying is there is a potential of a 0.2 or a 0.3 degree decrease in global warming temperatures if we're able to pull that lever sufficiently globally and not use HFCs. Now, the good thing is for the Philippines, for example, we're not a manufacturer of HFCs. So all our coolants are imported. So for a country like the Philippines that does not manufacture HFCs, it's really a matter of finding options of what to import. I do imagine that for countries with production of HFCs, it might be politically a bit more difficult to do the switch. But relatively speaking, it's easier to be done. So which is also why the Montreal Protocol was so successful, because we switched from CFCs to HFCs, and we did that on a global scale. And I believe that we can also do that on a global scale, switching from HFCs to organic coolants.
Okay, great, wonderful. And so you said you're at the Philippines. You're not in that situation, so that's of course a benefit when you're not a producer. When you're an importer, of course, other countries have more issues, more conflicts maybe there. But of course, it's good to see progress in that area, which was slow for a while. And I think also as a more observer of the policy space rather than the technology space, for me, it's amazing to see another international agreement or amendment to a protocol happening not so long ago. It gives hope also in a time where maybe international cooperation seems to be fading a little bit. And so hopefully we can carry over this spirit or this way of thinking also into other fields, including also other short-lived climate pollutants, but also, of course, into the global fight against climate change. And I want to say it's great the work you're doing at Clean Air Asia and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition in general. It's really great work. I hope we can do more work together in the future. I think there's a lot of need also for learning, especially you mentioned the city level. Of course, post-carbon cities of tomorrow, there's a lot of work on cities at the city level. And there too, cities are, of course, very interested in these co-benefits that you mentioned, the direct health benefits, the impact on also social justice and economic development. So these are very important questions, and they're important not only in Asia, but also in Europe and in North America. And I think even though we might be at different levels, the questions, the challenges are very related. You mentioned diesel, and we had other webinars here before on diesel. And I don't know how much of that you follow from afar, but of course in Europe, diesel pollution is a huge issue. We had the major manufacturers being dishonest about their emissions of their vehicles. And we still have huge, well, we have maybe more ambitious thresholds for air pollution in cities in Europe, but we're not meeting these targets. So there's a number of cities that are being violating EU regulations. And in some of these now we have driving bans being instituted, or there are court fights over driving bans. It's a huge issue in Germany, for example, at the moment. So I think there is a lot of comparability, even though things are, of course, very different. I wanted to ask you one thing, Alan, and we only have 3 minutes left, so there's very little time left. But I wanted to ask you, if you look at the world, and of course your focus is on Asia, and so you're totally forgiven if you only say something about Asia. But you mentioned earlier your short-lived climate pollutants by different categories and then by sectors. Now, are there any hotspots where you think, okay, it doesn't have to be a country; it can also be a region or a specific, you know, corridor where you think these are really areas where short-lived climate pollutants are major factors, and this is really like if I was a development agency, where are really the peaks in emissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to answer that, Max, it really depends on which pollutant you're talking about and what circumstances. For example, one hotspot for black carbon during the winter time specifically is Mongolia. Ulaanbaatar is a bowl, and it's the coldest capital in the world. And many of the people in the Gur district use heating, traditional heating. And if you imagine the cold air just closing down and just not being lifted, it's all there, and all the pollution is in that valley. So that is a hotspot for black carbon coming from household heating. In terms of black carbon from diesel emissions, we here in the Philippines, our PM2.5, the black carbon composition of PM2.5 is one of the highest in the world at 80%. In one of my previous slides, the world average, I showed that the world average is around 15% of PM2.5 is black carbon, but for the Philippines, we're at 80. And this is coming from our jeepneys. These are second-hand diesel public transportation engines that are been refurbished and don't have a specific end-of-life regulation right now. So that's a problem. For methane flaring, as I mentioned, the hotspots would be Nigeria and Russia. For black carbon coming from agricultural burning, the northern part of India is also a hotspot. In general, glacier areas are hotspots because near glacier areas are either cities like Kathmandu in Nepal, or mining operations, as I mentioned, in Chile. So when this happens, you have black carbon settling on glaciers, which accelerate the melting process. So those are hotspot areas as well. So as I said, it depends on the pollutant we're talking about, but generally those are the various hotspots around the globe.
Wonderful. I know this is difficult to answer, but I think it was very informative to hear your quick run through of various hotspots. I think that also gives us a lot of perspective on where additional action is necessary. Our time is up. I'm sorry, Alan, sorry.
I just wanted to point you to the website. On my very last slide, there's the website of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. So there's a lot more information there in terms of the initiative, in terms of the region. So you can go in there and just search and there's so much more information in there.
Wonderful. That's good. And I'll do that. And I suggest everybody else does that too. We'll also share your slides. Alan, thank you so very much for staying up so late, for being so awake so late. You seem to be not tired at all. So very good coffee in the Philippines, obviously. Thank you very much. I wanted to say thank you to our participants also for being patient. Again, sorry about the late start. Next week we have another webinar. We'll send out information about this one too with Oystein Leonardsen, who will talk about living labs, city labs in Copenhagen. So it will be more about the process of climate action in the city. This one will start on time, and but at the different time, at the p.m. Eastern time. You'll get information about this in an email. Alan, thank you very much. Please say also hello to Kat and all your colleagues. Hope to be in touch soon again. Have a great night, and everybody else, a great rest of your day. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.